Michael Rosen is an English children's novelist, poet, and hugely best-selling author of over 140 books. His first book of children's poems was published in 1974, and he's gone on to write a large number of award-winning books for children of all ages. In a change to his usual style, Michael's latest title is The Missing, The True Story of My Family in World War II, a personal, powerful and resonant account of the Holocaust, as Michael explores the true story of his search for his relatives who went missing during the Second World War, told through prose, poetry, maps and pictures. As we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day this year, Michael met with Nikki to talk more about his book and the stories behind it.
When I was growing up, my father used to say, I had two French uncles. Sometimes you say we, sometimes I, that's why I hesitated there. I had two French uncles. They were there at the beginning of the war and they weren't there at the end. So there was the idea that in France there were these people who had just been there and somehow disappeared. But as a 10-year-old, you can't make sense of that. I mean, it's you know about life and bread and school and streets and stuff, and you just say something like that, it's got a sort of supernatural quality about it that I didn't understand. And I would say, well, what happened? And he'd say, well, they must have died in the camps. And I know this sounds trivial and daft and facetious almost, but I knew about camps because we did a lot of camping. So when I heard the word camps as a child, that meant, camping holidays in Wales and in Yorkshire. As it happens, a bit later, I did know about camps, either through school or through radio programmes with people explaining things. And also we were in Germany in 1957, and my mum and dad went off to visit Buchenwald, because it was near to Weimar where we were staying, and my mum wouldn't let me and my brother come. And I can remember it quite clearly, and I think when I do the paperback I'm going to put this in the book, because she said you can't come, and my parents weren't like that usually. It was sort of, you were exposed to everything and anything. And I kept saying, why not? And she said, because terrible things. And then she came back and said, she was ashen. My mum had quite dark skin, and I can remember things, she looked quite grey. I can remember her face, and she said, terrible things. And the only thing I could think of was the torture room at the house at the Tower of London. You know, as a child, the word genocide or the Holocaust, they weren't around in the mid-50s. So I remember just thinking, well, was it something like the Tower of London? And that was as far as I knew, basically. But it was a mystery, and because it was a mystery, I wanted to know more about it. But there was no way, there's no access to it. It's the kind of thing with when people say, oh, you had a grandfather who went to America, and people in the 50s, you just go, well, that's it. They've gone to America. There was no way of finding them. And you see these programmes on the telly where people thought there was no way to find the person who disappeared or went away, and whether they're still alive or not. So that was how I sort of grew up until, well, in my 40s, and I thought, I wonder if there's a way of finding out more. So that's sort of when I started. So that is, yes, nearly 30 years ago, isn't it?
One of the things that struck me is that you do start with your own story. That's the way into this. Some of the things that you've just talked about here. And I think you said it seemed horrifying, awful, but I didn't really get it. That's what you've just explained to us. I think as you get older, you appreciate that something that seemed so remote to you, but actually must have been so present for the adults in our lives, because it was so recent, that history.
That's right. I was born in 1946, so all mentions of the war are to me so near but so far. So anything that's gone on in the 30s and the 40s, I used to think as a child was the other side of some huge gulf, that it was as distant as the Normans. But then as I've grown up, you realise how near it is. And I'm thinking, well, all these huge, the upheaval, and it's not just a bomb here or a bomb there. It's this conflagration across the whole of Europe, into the Pacific, into China. This is a world conflagration involving millions of people, and millions of people dying, being killed and starving, and the rest of it. The whole world is sort of coming to a kind of end, it must have felt like.
So imagine then what it's like for us working in education, where we somehow want to convey some of this to young people, and it was hard enough for us to grasp that when it was just a stone's throw away, and now we are 2 or 3 generations on. And it's quite right that we have Holocaust Memorial Day, and that Holocaust is the only statutory history in the Key Stage 3 national curriculum. But it's very easy to take the wrong steps to get there. So I really appreciate this book, which starts with the personal, because that often is what's missing, I think.
Well, indeed, you can put the statistics down on paper, and I have in the book, because you can't escape from the statistics, but actually, ultimately, there is a way in which statistics don't mean anything, or if they do mean something, it's very, very remote. I mean, if we say the Holocaust in its totality of all its victims is 15 million, the totality of the Jewish victims is 6 million. What do these figures mean? You can't hold 6 million. If I say, well, the population of London, Greater London, is 9 million, well, you get a sense of all these houses, but it's not people, is it, massed together? So you can only start to make sense of those things if you realise how that, and it's an industrial, it's a scientific machine that did the killing. If you realise that it involves people face to face, and people are following instructions, and they're putting people on trains, or they're knocking on doors, or they've got pieces of paper in front of them, or they're writing reports, and that these people have lives, they belong to you. So I suppose I had studied the Holocaust, I had, through the 80s for a variety of reasons, but I had actually worked on it and tried to understand things, and I've followed read many books, read very wonderful children's fiction and children's historical books on it in particular. Stories of the Warsaw Ghetto, and obviously Anne Frank's diary and that sort of thing. Even met Anne Frank's cousin, and I met the woman who helped look after the Franks. But it wasn't my lot. I mean, just to be really crude about it. So all I had was the expression on my father's face saying they were there at the beginning of the war and they weren't there at the end. Who? And these sort of, the Rosens were spread out all across Poland, France, Britain and America. So his father's family, there's 8 of them, they're spread out, and he only sort of knew of them rather than knew them. And so there's a kind of nearness but distance about that as well.
I was astonished that you could find things out. I thought everything would just be hidden, and yet there were records.
Yes, so it depends where you go and which part of the Holocaust. I gather that some places it's harder to find out things than others. I think Poland, for example, is that many records disappeared, destroyed, burnt, whatever. In France, the point was that these things were hidden. They did used to be hidden. They were hidden in, actually, state and departmental archives. So they were hidden in the sense that people couldn't get to them unless they had some particular reason to do so and had to sign a lot of things. But also, they're lists of what are called fichiers juifs in French. These are forms that officials filled in of foreign-born Jews. So, technically, according to the Constitution of France, you were not allowed to list people by belief. So you're not allowed to say Catholic, Buddhist, Muslim. So one of the ways they got round it in France, as I understand it, is they started with foreign-born, and then, of course, that then covered the naturalised as well. But also, at the end of the war, they were still, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but they were snatching, put it really crudely, anyone who was identifiable as a Jew. In other words, somebody who had been shopped, fingers being pointed and saying them, but also, tragically and awfully and rather well known, for example, Jewish orphans, as les enfants d'Isieux, as it's known, the children of Isieux, where basically the Nazis started to have a free run in the end of 43 into 44 and just went snatching, in spite of the so-called accords between Vichy France, the the official government of inside France at that time, and the Nazis. So they overran even the Accord, which was supposedly only about foreign-born Jews. I know this all sounds terribly technical, but it's very relevant to my lot, because they were born in Poland and then went to France, one before the First World War, one after the Second World War, because they thought France was a safer place to be than Poland, which experienced a lot of anti-Semitism and what are known as pogroms, which we would call, I suppose, roundups and persecution and random attacks. So they had escaped Poland to come to France, where it seemed much safer.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the way the book is written. So it is, it's a narrative, it's the account of your search, but it's also interspersed with these wonderful poems. Although you did mark them out as distinct by calling them special rooms. So obviously there's something that the poem allows you to do.
Yes.
That the other kind of writing didn't.
Good, so here it is. It's called The Absentees. There are gaps, there are blanks in the house of my life. There's a face, nothing more, something gone from my life. She was here, he was there, in the rooms of my life. There's a place for them both in the words of my life. So, yes, Nikki, no, absolutely. I do sometimes find the idiom of rooms, I think it's a line from the Bible, isn't it? My father's house, my father's mansion has many rooms, which I find quite interesting, because there is the idea, isn't it? We those of us who are urban, we kind of walk through rooms, we live in rooms, but also imaginatively speaking, we can say, well, today I'm the kind of person who goes to a football match, and then there's another place, today I'm the person who goes to an art gallery, and today I'm the person who's sitting on my own watching telly or something. So you have these different places, and obviously in experience terms we have sad rooms and happy rooms and bereft rooms and so on. So in this case I felt that there were the rooms of my life that aren't there, so these were sort of absent or empty rooms, but then words, that's one of the ways in which we people the things that have gone, or, you know, so my mum and dad aren't alive, but I've got all these words about them. So there's a mum room or a dad room, and then these are words.
You are also, through this book, holding the hand of the reader through history, and so there are bits that are pure exposition because you have to give an explanation for it. And one of the things that struck me as a teacher was how in some way this was a model for how we explain things to children. It can be very easy when you're talking about something as, and I'm going to use the word dreadful as the Holocaust, to overlay it with lots of adjectives and adverbs. And actually your explanations are very clear and they're very succinct, and they don't flow into these descriptions of what the events were like. Is that a conscious thing that you do?
I think so, because actually the book came out of work that I did with Professor Helen Weinstein in Cambridge. So what she wanted was for me to work with year 6s to year 9s or 10s leading up to Holocaust Memorial Day. So she was interested, and I worked with a woman who's a survivor, this is Eva, she was born in Auschwitz. So I worked with her telling the story of my relatives, it's in this book, and Eva was telling the story mostly of her mother. And then Helen is very interested in empathy work, in other words, that you encourage children to write or to act or to make music or to make songs. And so I did that for a couple of years. But of course, you can do the empathy work or you can do poetry, but the advantage of that is you feel it and you have a sense of knowing about what it might have been to suddenly realise you're being deported, say. But there is a lack in that. There's a lack if you've got no idea why this is happening. And there are reasons. It's not justifications, let's be quite clear. These are reasons. So, you know, we worked with a guy who was a survivor from another genocide. I won't go into details of it. And there are always these reasons why. So I felt and did in the schools, felt that I had to explain and say, well, look, when you say France, for some very young people, they don't know where France is. If you say, then they went to Poland, well, it's got no meaning to a young child if they haven't looked at an atlas or looked at things. So you realise as you work, if you do empathy work, how it can be so far from what people actually understand in terms of what you might call empirical knowledge. So I'm interested in the idea of marrying the two together. So when I talk to children, just on a different level, the sort of jokey stuff to do with my childhood, then I like to say to them, well, I was brought up in North London, so people know I came from North London, and it was a suburban type of place, and there were parks and stuff. So it's like, it is about mucking about in the house and so on. We lived in a flat over a shop. I like the topographical, empirical detail of it, so that it's got a kind of historical validity. So it's very anti-poetic of me, I understand that. But I'm, to be honest, actually, what you touched on is the way I'm torn, because part of me is exposition and part of me wants to be mythological. Because myth has its power. I mean, when we do Perseus and the Gorgons, nobody says, precisely where were they? Were they in Greece or not? You know what I mean? It's lovely to know these things came out of Greece, but it sort of, in a funny sort of way, it doesn't matter, does it? So you can hear there's some conflict in what I'm talking about here. That these things can tell you stuff in a mythic or legendary way, and that has power. But then what's important about the Holocaust is that it isn't mythic, right? I mean, I have an argument with, say, Elie Wiesel's Night, which is incredibly moving, but it's kind of mythic. So you could read it and go, what an amazing and extraordinary and awful myth. Hang on a minute, it's not a myth. That's not Elie Wiesel's fault. It's how he wanted to write about it. But if in a book like this, where I'm saying, I found this out, this was a piece of paper that says my father's uncle was arrested on this particular day, then you also want to say, look, actually, this didn't just happen to the two people in my family, this was happening to millions of others. This train left at this point on that day. Because we also have to put into the context that people say it didn't happen.
And of course, one thing that we in Britain as an island didn't really have to face in the aftermath of the war is what that meant for communities there who had been pulled against each other, informed on each other. I mean, it must have been very hard to live in Germany, in post-war Germany.
And France, indeed. I mean, I know France very well, and there are people that if you start talking about this stuff, they will tell you, but they know who was in the resistance and who shopped other people in the resistance and who was on which side. People forget that France in the last 6-9 months was in civil war, and that you had a force organised by the government called La Milice, which is basically the militia, and you had people in the resistance. So you had a civil war and an occupying army. Now, people don't come out of that situation unscathed, and it lasts for generations. And the only way people get through it is to say nothing, actually. I mean, the silence in French villages is terrifying in a way. And as it happens, in the next edition of the book, there'll be some information that has come from a history teacher in one of the villages. Because I kept writing on Twitter and Facebook to one of the villages and said, does anyone ever heard of this thing where this single Jewish guy, who happens to be my great uncle, lived here, and he was staying in the house of this woman called Madame Bobière, and then suddenly this history teacher popped up and said, I can help you. And he's found out some things which will be able to go in the next edition, like, for example, that these two uncles that the book's about fought on opposite sides in the First World War. And he wants to commemorate my father's uncle in some way in the village if he's allowed.
Yeah, interesting. So you obviously discovered a lot about your family through this 30-year investigation. I'm interested to know whether you discovered anything about yourself through that process of searching.
I never thought of myself as somebody who's a bit kind of dogged and persistent. And I remember while my father was doing his PhD, this is quite a funny little story, while my father was doing his PhD, which he largely did, you knew my father, so he largely did it at the kitchen table while we were eating. So he kept picking up all these words that he'd suddenly throw out at the table. So I was about 13 or 14, suddenly you'd hear a word say, this is extraordinary. Look at this. there's two words, there's perseverance and there's perseveration. And we're going, could you just pass the cornflakes, actually? And you go, yes, you see, perseverance, we all know. Perseveration is where you go on persevering, even though you know that you may not get a result, or it may even be face to face with the resistance of not getting what you want, but you still perseverate. So he had found this in some book or other, you see. So, but it's stuck in my mind, perseveration. It's probably not a word that even really exists, but anyway. So I can remember him saying that. So I think I discovered about myself that I have this rather weird, dogged way of pursuing something, even though there doesn't really seem to be any possibility. I mean, the whole story of Martin in the book, which comes at the end, that only came about because I can't think how many hours I sat on the computer typing in Martin Rosen, spelt in different ways, and putting it into the field, and up popped one day an account made by some lycée students of a family called the Glansberg in French, you would say, the Glansberg family, and incredibly in it were some documents, and there was someone called Martin Rosen with a Z, and I could just piece together for the amount of information that he came from the same town as the Martin Rosen that I knew, my father's uncle, Metz, and a lot of other things seemed to tally, which for the moment I can't remember, but other things seemed to tally. So suddenly I had this piece of information. Well, I only got it because of just going on and on and on and finding websites, and there are associations of deportees in France who do try to help you, and I think they're done by volunteers, so you can write and not hear from them for 6 months. But they've, in 2014 I think it is, they opened up the archives in France, and suddenly in these archives are the stories of, so I have here a piece of paper which I summarise in the book, but I don't actually reproduce it in the book. I just wrote to the archives in La Vendée, which is the département, and that's the police account of the arrest of my father's uncle. You can't really read it, but I remember when this came through, and it is just frightening because it is so ordinary. I mean, this is, it says there, you can see Gendarmerie Nationale. So that's the gendarmes, the local coppers. These are bobbies. These are the nice guys who tell you, that you can't go down that road, you've got to go down another one or something. And they're local people. So here they are. They've been told, according to the local prefect, which we don't have in this country, but it's a particular office in France, that they've got to arrest all the Jews. So they've turned up at this house, and they've done their job. They've arrested this bloke called Martin Rosen. And then on this sheet, you can see it's a description of him here, about how he's 1.62 meters high, and he's got brown hair, and he's got flat shoes, and he's got yellow trousers and so on. So there, and it's signed, there you can see him signed, and then here it says the names of the 4 policemen. So 4 policemen at 2:30 in the morning on the last day of January 44 have turned up at this, and they've just then arrested him, taken him to a little local town, Roche-sur-Yon, where the local barracks of the German occupying forces are, just handed him over.
And what's so horrifying is the ordinary, this could be like giving someone a parking ticket.
Absolutely, same piece of paper. And you've got to remember, this is actually murder. This is the police, they're accessories to murder. They may not have known they were, but they must have had some idea. What are they doing arresting a civilian who's done nothing wrong and handing him over to the occupying forces, and the only reason given by the occupying forces is because he's a Jew? I mean, it is mind-blowing as a piece of paper. I keep coming back to it, that the ordinariness of it, but also the finality of it, because this is what's done it. And as I say in the book, I said, did they go off and have breakfast after that?
I mean, that's what I find so shocking. When I said to you earlier, I was surprised at how you could find evidence, because you would imagine these things are so horrific that it would all be hidden, that it would be destroyed, that people wouldn't want to know, but it's there and it's so ordinary.
I was surprised when I said, I gave them the name, and he had a Hebrew name as well, Chilmaya, and I said, could you see if there's anything there? And it came back, I think, about a day later. Said, yes, this. She didn't ask who I was or anything like that. So this is very good. I mean, France has liberated these archives. And it is amazing that it's kept there, but I think probably, you're not allowed to destroy documents. And I think Vichy was caught on the hop, so just to remind people if they don't know, say Vichy is the government of France at that time. They were probably caught on the hop, so they didn't get a chance to destroy the stuff if they might have wanted to. Possibly thought maybe no one would be bothered. Maybe it's the arrogance of power.
So you get into that mentality.
And then it sat there unopened. I doubt whether that piece of paper had been looked at since 1944. I was effectively the first. I haven't seen it. I haven't got the facsimile of it, but it's probably the first time it was touched. And as it happens, in that part of France, there's another 280 or so of the same bits of paper. A very good local history is coming out in France, where people are writing, quite extraordinary actually, people are writing local histories, which are giving an account of what happened. So I used those as well.
Interesting. So as part of this is finding out for yourself, but of course then you're writing a book which is to in some way preserve that memory for other people. So I wanted to really ask you some questions, or a question about memory and the burden of memory. And you actually wrote, I think, that it was so that the Nazis wouldn't have won. The memorial is for that reason. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you also talked about Holocaust survivors. When I've been reading about Holocaust education, some of the criticisms have been that the burden of memory has been on the people who've had to live it.
I think that burden on the survivors has been intolerable for them sometimes, and others have felt duty bound and are proud. And I've sat with survivors, Esther Brunstein, Leon Greenman, Eva Clark, as I say, and I made a radio programme about memorialising the Holocaust for Radio 4 and met some survivors and talked with them. Some are desperate to tell and to bear witness, and others it's in a way, the way they find it bearable is to stay quiet about it and the things they saw. And then others have had the survivor's guilt. Others have had this terrible thing. Why did I survive and my mother or father or grandfather, whatever, didn't? And so there's almost a sort of feeling that I've heard people describe as sort of almost as if they've been complicit. I mean, it's horrifying. Of course they're not in any way at all. And I've been at two ceremonies in Paris because in Paris they held ceremonies for the convoys. So I went over to the Musée or Fondation de la Shoah in Paris, and they've got the names of every person who was deported and never came back on the wall, engraved on the wall. So my father's uncle's names are on the wall there. And then one was on Convoy 62, one was on Convoy 68. And so I went across for both of these ceremonies. And you can see, I mean, you're talking there are people there who are survivors, they're very few. The rest are relatives. And for them, it seemed to be very, very important just to be there and to acknowledge each other. Because there's another bit of this history, is that as you get more and more personal with it, you start to think it only happened to this person. So you're constantly going to and fro between individual experience and group experience. So there's all that's going on. The matter of bearing witness, I think that one of the advantages of someone of my generation doing it is that the personal hurt is not so great that you can't put it down. I mean, the thing about my father's cousin in America, who couldn't bear to tell the story as they knew it and the information they had, was it was too painful because they felt themselves personally responsible. So my father's cousin Ted, well, to be really crude about it, he fibbed. He said he didn't know stuff that he did know, because sitting in the closet behind him while he was telling me about the baseball was this pile of photographs. That only after he died, aged 103, and his son Teddy went into the room, the locked closet, opened it, and inside that was a box sealed up that said family photos. He opened it up, and there's the faces and the names, the regiments they fought in, of these relatives that I'd spent the previous 25 years or so with no picture, never thinking there'd ever be an image of them. and then suddenly, boom, there are these very good photographs of them that were sitting in the closet 5 feet away from us while we watched the baseball, and I was saying, do you know anything else, Ted? And he'd say, well, you tagged the guy on the first base, and he wouldn't tell me.
Yeah.
They probably thought it wouldn't get any worse than a war that would blow over. You know, we're so familiar with the notion of the Holocaust. How could you know what that is in 39, 40, 41, 42, 43? The idea of a consciously thought out industrial scientific genocide, people don't realise that that's what's different about it. Obviously, because I'm Jewish, I know about it, but actually this is the thing for the whole human race, is that most genocides are kind of violent acts within a war of one lot taking retribution on another lot. At the end of the day, it's just the same. People are killed. The outcome is the same. It's the intention to do something that is so deliberate and thought out that's what is the kind of horror of it that I think the human race has to cope with.
Just coming to the end of your book, where you actually, for your readers, recommend or list some other books that they might like to read. One of my favourites, Morris Gleitzman's Monks, is on that list. And then there are some notable exceptions. And I suspect they're exceptions for a reason. So if you don't mind, I will name Boy in the Striped Pyjamas.
I didn't leave it out deliberately, as it happens, because I saw the film, and I fully understand when people say, well, it couldn't have happened, that, you know, a boy doing that. And it's a very similar plot line to Rose Blanche, the idea of the boy or the girl as a kind of, well, the character is the idiot savant, that's what it's called in fiction, the knowing fool or the knowing innocent, so that you use the vehicle of the innocent in order to tell the story. And that's got huge problems as far as the Holocaust is concerned, because the burden is on the child, and therefore you put the burden on the child reader, as if somehow or other it's your job as a child to be the witness, the teller, and in some way or another you get implicated. I worry about some of the ecological stuff and climate change. You know, what are you going to do today? Make sure you turn the tap off. And it's sort of that thing of wanting to inform children. And obviously, because in children's literature we make the child the agent, but suddenly these terrible things, the child has to sort of somehow or other take it on. So, but as it happens, I've heard my own son talk about it. He's now 15, and I think he, I put this crudely, learnt a lot from it. That he would rather watch a film than listen to me gassing on about it. But you can occupy another space as a child, and then he can ask questions. So that's my Boy with Striped Pyjamas. My problem with Rose Blanche are several. One is this problem that it's fiction, but it's shown in neorealism. Now, I think that creates all sorts of problems. Are these people real? The problem if you do that is that there's a way in which children might think that you're reading something that is true, but it isn't, it's fiction. Obviously people have been doing this for years. Daniel Defoe did it with Joan of the Plague Year and Mole Flanders. He said, this is really true, and people believed it was. Now, that's a kind of joke and a kind of parody, but this is up the other end, and it's with children. So there's a problem if you say this is true and you think that maybe Rose Blanche really did exist. Now then you get to the end, and I have to say this quite carefully, but the end implies, it doesn't state it, but it implies that there's a sacrifice, and that the sacrifice is somehow or other worth it. Now, the problem with sacrifice and martyrdom is that, no, there is no point to the Holocaust. I'm sorry, but there is no sacrifice and no martyrdom involved. That is a sort of Christian idea that the pain of Jesus was done for our benefit. Now, if you believe that, that's fine. If you don't believe it, then this person, this Jewish rebel, Jesus, was killed. That's it. He was just killed for having been a rebel. Crucifixion, end of. If you believe it was done for our benefit, that's fine. That's the religious meaning of Christianity. If you take that trope, that motif, and lay it over the Holocaust, which is what I believe unconsciously the writers and the illustrators have done, I think there's a real problem because, first of all, as far as I understand, Judaism doesn't have that idea of martyrdom and sacrifice, that through death somehow or other you or your ancestor, your people who come after you are redeemed. That idea doesn't. That's a pure Christian idea. But also, independently of whether it's Judaism, someone like me who's not a believer, there is no redemption here. You cannot. I would argue, don't look at the Holocaust and imagine there is anything redeeming about it. There are people who behave well, and that's in its own way encouraging, hopeful. I don't even think it's redemptive in the true sense of the word. You know, you find these people who, incredible danger, helped each other, saved people, all sorts of wonderful things that people did in the face of this terror. But it's not redemptive. Yeah. And let's remember that if you have the idea that a death, which happens, the feeling that you get at the end, oh well, it's all right, and the flowers have grown, and there's a real factual muddle at the end about the troops arriving.
And who, yeah.
And who and why, and, because the whole business of the liberation of the camps, the fact some were liberated by the Brits and some were liberated by the Russians and so on, there's a whole factual muddle at the end that is really, I find, quite irritating. So, for me, Rose Blanche is full of problems, put it that way.
Yeah. Can you tell us what you're doing for Holocaust Memorial Day this year? I understand that you've got some songs and children involved. What's
yes,
that
well,
about?
you've got it's yes. Well, again, this is with Professor Alan Weinstein and History Works in Cambridge, and she gets me to come and visit schools and has done for the last 4 or 5 years, and we do local history and Holocaust Memorial and how that has affected people in different ways within the whole Cambridge area. And when I say Cambridge, people often think the university, posh people going to university. No, Cambridge is a very ordinary town with some, huge areas of deprivation of one sort or another. So it's quite a very interesting place, Cambridge, and the outer Cambridge as well. And so for several years I've been going in, reading poems, writing lyrics, which are then put to music, which the children learn. And some of it might be about how the railways came to Cambridge, some of it might be about the leper chapel, all sorts of things like that. But also, around Holocaust Memorial Day, for 2 or 3 years, what we've been doing is I've been telling this story, and then the children or school students, secondary school students, have been writing poems about refugees, taking up whatever has been the word or phrase that Holocaust Memorial Day, each year they have different phrases. This year it's Stand Together. And writing poems and stories about that, writing stuff about their own family, singing some of the songs that have been written, but also doing dramatisations of this story or of other stories. And then on the day itself, we're going to have more poems, more songs, more plays, and it's going to be, I think, in the Guildhall this year.
Fantastic. I will try to be there. Can I say
do.
Thank you so much for talking to me this afternoon. Thank you for writing the book.
Thank you. Thanks for talking to me. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.